Hey fellow AP Lang teachers, Beth Hall here from Coach Hall Writes. Today's teacher tip video is all about revisions and peer editing in AP Lang. Revision is a valuable part of the AP Lang process, and it's also mentioned in the Common Core standards and many state standards. Students need to understand that we don't always do everything in a one and done rough draft. However, oftentimes when we're preparing for the AP Lang exam and we're trying to get our students to do timed writes, it becomes that one and done situation. And there's a time and place for that. There absolutely is. However, we want to ask ourselves, when is it appropriate to offer students the opportunity to revise? So there's a couple of things that I tend to think of when I'm trying to decide if I want to allow my own students to have the opportunity to revise. The first is the assignment their first attempt at that type of essay? Because if it is, I usually let them revise because I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to grow and to reinforce whatever feedback they've been given. Writing is a craft, and students get better at writing through feedback and through exposure, but that doesn't mean that they always have to write essays. If you've watched my previous teacher tip videos, chances are you've heard me talk about the fact that I give my students shorter writing assignments. Now, with the longer writing assignments, one of the things that I think about in terms of should I offer a revision is how am I going to address these issues that I've seen? So is it necessary to keep going with this same text and to let them revise and handle it that way? Or am I going to use the comments that I wrote as feedback for future instruction and use that feedback as part of forthcoming lessons? So you don't always have to allow for revision, but you do want to ask yourself, is it going to be more purposeful if I allow them to revise this, or should I work that into forthcoming lessons? If I'm being honest, one of my own hesitancies toward revision is that it seems like it creates a bit more work for the teacher. So there is another method to this that will incorporate peer editing and revision. So one method would be, instead of you providing comments and then having your students revise based on those comments, you can actually have your students peer edit first. Let the students revise based on the peer edits, and then you can grade the final draft. So this is actually a really effective way to allow for collaboration, but having done this in the past, there are some things that I think you need to think about. So the first is, are the students familiar with the rubric itself? So it doesn't necessarily have to be the AP Lang rubric. It could be whatever rubric you're using for the essay, but are they familiar with the terms and the criteria? Because if not, it's going to make that a little bit harder. In order for peer editing to be effective, students need to know what to comment on. And so one of the things that you need to think about is, have you modeled that process for them? I personally don't have my students do peer edits until later in the first semester or during the second semester, because I want to make sure that they are comfortable with not only the rubric, but what type of feedback is appropriate. Because if you don't do that process with them, oftentimes you'll get students writing good, or they might write really mean comments on people's papers. And we want to practice the art of constructive criticism, but we also need them to know what they're supposed to be pointing out in someone else's paper. And if they haven't received feedback yet from you as the teacher, chances are they're probably not going to know what to say about somebody else's paper. I've done peer edits a couple different ways in the past. Usually for the first time that I have my students peer edit, I let them choose a partner. This helps them feel more comfortable. Chances are they choose somebody that they're already very familiar with and that they trust. And so that I have found is more effective than assigning partners. Now, if you have a class that is maybe on the smaller side or that's very close and you feel comfortable assigning partners based on your own criteria, that's okay too. Something else to consider is, will the submissions be anonymous? So I've done this before as well too, where I knew who wrote each essay, but the students didn't. So they had to comment on somebody else's paper, but they didn't know whose paper it was. Now that takes a little bit of extra legwork in setting it up, but that can also be valuable as well. Something else that you could do is peer editing stations, where you have students go around and at each station they're looking for something different in a person's paper. I personally don't love that method because it's a lot of extra setup. However, I have seen some other teachers do it really well. If you have been watching my recent teacher tip videos, you know that for the past few videos, I've been including a free template for you guys in the description box below. Now, this video is no different. So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I want my students to peer edit, but I don't know what to tell them to look for. Or if you're like, I like the revision idea, but I'm not really sure how to orchestrate that in my classroom, I've got some handouts that might help. So one of them is going to be a free resource on TPT, and that is specifically handouts for rhetorical analysis. So if you download that freebie, you'll get a rhetorical analysis peer edit checklist, a self-reflection checklist, and also just a general checklist for a rhetorical analysis revision. Now, if you want that same thing for not only rhetorical analysis, but also the other FRQs, argument and synthesis, there's a link for that as well. And by the way, both resources have a PDF, and then within that PDF is also a link to a Google Doc that you can use as well in case you want a digital version. Part of the reason why I like the checklist is because it gives students a clear focus and clear expectations. When I first started teaching and I had my students revise, I basically just said, okay, here's your paper back. I wrote some comments, go ahead and revise and turn it in. And I think I told them to highlight the new stuff so I could kind of see what they had done in their revision. And honestly, I got back a variety of things. I got back an entire paper that was highlighted yellow because the student took me very literally and they decided to revamp their whole paper. So since it was all new, they highlighted everything. I had other students who just changed out a word or two and that was the only thing they highlighted and they didn't address the content at all. And I realized as a first-year teacher that that was my mistake because I had good intentions, but I hadn't really told them what to revise or how to actually interpret the comments that I had left on their paper. So if you're thinking about the checklist, that's one of the reasons why I think they're valuable is because it gives students a clear focus. And even if students don't feel like they're a strong writer themselves, it gives them talking points. I said earlier that writing is a craft and students take a while to learn the different skills needed to write a strong essay. So sometimes on a checklist like the one I provided, students might not have actually mastered all of those skills, and that's okay. Now with a revision, they might get that extra time to do it better than what they did in a time setting. But it's also important to remember that we want to make slow and steady progress. So even if a student hasn't fully mastered a skill, we as teachers can say, okay, that's what we need to work on. We also want to prioritize different skills. So for instance, we want our students to have a defensible thesis because that leads to a stronger essay. So that would be something that we'd really want to focus on if it wasn't defensible the first time. We also might want to focus on the quality of their evidence and then the quality of their commentary. Students don't often write very strong commentary on their first try, especially at the beginning of the year. So we also want to reinforce this idea that while we have a checklist, it's a checklist that is an ongoing process as well. If you like these teacher tip videos and the resources that go with them, then you're going to love the emails that I send out to those on my AP Lang teacher email list. You can get all these tips and resources sent straight to your inbox. The link for that is in the description box below. When you join, you'll also receive my 5 tips for teaching rhetorical analysis.